This video is relevant for Paper 2, Political Parties, and it is intended to give you a brief introduction to the history and policies of the two main political parties in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats. The two political parties are often referred to as big tents, and that is because they cover a wide ideological span, and therefore there's not a lot of room in American politics for third parties. We're going to look at how a split of the vote beyond more than two parties caused political chaos in the United States in 1860. And both the electoral system, the electoral college, but also American politics and the dichotomy between liberal and conservative, north and south, it's always seemed to split itself into two. And so these two big tent parties attract the vast majority of votes at every congressional and presidential election. We're going to start with the Democrats, because the Democrats are the older of the two political parties. They were officially founded in 1828 from the Democratic Republican Party. So the official first full name of the Democrats was the Democratic Republicans. And that was under President Jackson, the seventh president of the United States, who you can see pictured there in the top left. And they were quite often the party of the South and the party of states' rights and small government. And states' rights regarded the right of individual states to make its own laws on the key issues of the day. And what's going to tear the Democratic Party apart in the 19th century is the issue of slavery. They'd begun to split already between North and South and the factions way before 1860. But in 1860, we get a strange situation within the Democratic Party. They have two conventions, one in the North and one in the South, which elect nominate, two presidential candidates. So in 1860, there are two Democrats on the ballot paper, and that is Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge. And what you can see there is that Douglas and Breckinridge, between them, get more votes than the winning candidate in 1860, Abraham Lincoln. However, because the Democratic vote is split, it all but ensures Republican victory in 1860. During the Civil War, most Southern Democrats took seats in the Confederate legislature and seceded with their states. There were a rare number of Southern Democrats who remained loyal to the Union. In the North, the Democrats were split between the War and the Peace Democrats. The War Democrats were supportive of the Union war effort against the South, whereas the Peace Democrats were willing to negotiate a compromise and a settlement with the Confederacy. And after the Civil War and the North's victory in it, the Democrats were in the political wilderness. From 1869 to 1885, we only have a one-term Democrat president, which is Grover Cleveland, and he served another term, 1893 to 97. And the Democrats spent a lot of time out of power. But as they slowly begin to liberalise in the 20th century, things begin to change. You can see at the bottom of the slide here, President Woodrow Wilson, president from 1913 to 21. He favoured interventionist foreign policy. He was the architect of the 14 points, which was the basis of the Treaty of Versailles. He involved America in the First World War in 1917, and America begins to involve itself in European affairs. Now, that was not something that the Democrats had intended in its previous iterations, but it started to look outwards to the world. And then a huge change. In the 1930s, after the Wall Street crash, the Democrats become the party of government intervention under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His New Deal brings with it the so-called New Deal coalition. This gathering of voters, quite a strange collection of voters, which essentially ensured Democratic dominance in the 30s and 40s. The New Deal coalition consisted of those southern white conservatives that had always voted for the Democrats, but also began to win the votes of Catholics, ethnic minorities, and poor voters in the North. The Democrats were absolutely dominant under FDR, and they won elections thanks to support both North and South, and it tended to be a wide range of voters supporting the Democratic Party. Then in the 1960s, it takes another huge shift, and the big group of voters from the New Deal coalition that the Democrat Party lose in the 1960s are those southern white conservatives. The Democrats had always been able to rely on the so-called solid South ever since Jackson in the 1820s. However, when JFK and LBJ, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, become the presidents supportive of the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation, southern white voters turn their back on the party. In the 32 years from 1969, when Lyndon Baines Johnson resigns from office, and 2001, in those 32 years they were in power for just 12 of them. There was the one-term president Jimmy Carter, 1977 to 81, and then Clinton served 2 terms, 1993 to 2001. In the 80s, America was dominated by Reaganism, a Republican faction committed to free market economics and this concept that the wealth would trickle down. And the Democrats really struggled to break through with a coherent opposition message. There were these voters called the Reagan Democrats, and they were individuals who consistently voted for Democrats in Congress, but gave their presidential vote to Reagan. However, in the post-Reagan era, things have looked much better for the Democratic Party. Since 1993, they've won the popular vote at presidential elections 7 out of 8 times. 2 of their 3 defeats came despite winning the popular vote. So the only time that the Democrats have lost the popular vote and an election in the 21st century is in 2004. The other 2 times that they lost elections, the year 2000 and 2016, the Democratic Party lost the election in the Electoral College, but had actually won the popular vote. So who are the Democrats today? Well, they're the party of big government. They're in favour of social security programmes, higher taxes on the wealthy, but tax cuts for lower earners, higher minimum wage, universal healthcare, more spending on public services, particularly when it comes to education. Most Democrats are pro-choice. They are in favour of gun control. They are in favour of minority rights, and that could take the form of LGBT plus rights or affirmative action programmes to increase the representation of minorities in public institutions such as universities. And they also generally oppose the death penalty. Now, there are factions within the Democratic Party, and you will be learning about those at a later date. But in a nutshell, that is what the Democrats stand for today. Moving on now to the Republicans. The Republican nickname is the Grand Old Party. And that's ironic because they are the younger of the two. They were founded in 1854. And it came as the old Whig Party began to splinter. The issue of slavery was tearing America apart between North and South. And the Whig Party's position was to do very little about it. So when it splintered, some Whigs went to the Democrats and others began to form this so-called Republican movement. There was also a movement called the Know-Nothings, and it was a strange coalition of individuals, the people who first founded the Republican Party. Quite often you will see in articles, particularly pro-Republican ones, that the Republicans were founded on anti-slavery and racial equality. And that's not entirely accurate. Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president who won the election in 1860, simply opposed the extension of slavery in the 1860s. It was only as a result of the Civil War that he and the wider Republican movement came to advocate the end of slavery altogether. So who was voting for the Republicans in the 1860s? Mostly Northern Protestants, anti-slavery supporters, but also those with anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiments, these so-called nativist Protestants in the North. It was a strange coalition. In the 160 years since they first won that election in 1860, they've won 22 out of the 40 presidential elections. They were dominant after the Civil War in particular. They were the party of big business in the North. But they entered the political wilderness after the Wall Street crash in 1929. Before that, under Theodore Roosevelt, and you can see Teddy Roosevelt with his spectacles on bottom left, Teddy Roosevelt saw America as the world's policeman. And under Roosevelt, both America and the Republican Party began to take an outward look to the rest of the world and saw America's opportunity to become a world superpower. And yes, you might recognise the surname. Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican president, is the cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic president we spoke about on the last slide. After the First World War, the Republicans began to promote a policy of isolationism, moving away from Teddy Roosevelt's interventionist or outward-looking foreign policy. And that America First mindset served the Republican Party very well, particularly in the 1920s, when the American economy was performing particularly healthily. That all changed with the Wall Street crash. Herbert Hoover said that prosperity was just around the corner. And whilst his Democratic rival, Franklin Roosevelt, was promising a New Deal for the American people, Hoover was just telling the Americans to sit tight and things would get better soon. And for those in dire poverty, that simply wasn't enough. In the years 1932 to 1964, the Republicans won just one election, and that was Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was a war hero, and therefore Americans, North and South, were grateful for his role in America's victory in the Second World War. But he was also a moderate Republican and took steps to intervene in issues of civil rights. And so it seemed to be that the Republicans could only win elections with a more moderate stance. Their success began to change with Nixon's Southern strategy of 1968. We can see Nixon pictured bottom right. He came up with this strategy to win the vote of those disaffected, mostly white Southerners who had abandoned the Democrats because of their support for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And we see this great flip. If we go back to 1860 and Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in southern states. In the South, Lincoln's name was dirt. Lincoln was an individual who was seeking to impose his politics and himself, his way of life, on the southern people. But by the 1960s, 108 years later, Nixon was starting to win the South. The Democrats started to take the North. So we see this flip of loyalties geographically. Then comes the 1980s and the dominance of the Republicans under President Reagan and his economic policy, which was entitled Reaganomics. This was a firm commitment to free market economics, stripping back the state, cutting government spending, and it came with a commitment that wealth would trickle down. If you liberated the economic freedom of the most fortunate, their increased spending power would eventually trickle down to those at the bottom of society. And Reagan won the votes of the so-called Reagan Democrats, traditional Democrat voters who identified with his politics. The next big shift really is under George W. Bush. And remember that we said in the last slide, the Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. Under George W. Bush, the Republicans took an internationalist approach. Bush was a so-called neo-conservative. He sought to intervene in world affairs and took America into long, expensive, and some would argue, disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Bush also saw himself as a compassionate conservative. The only election that the Republicans have won the popular vote in is 2004. And that was largely because of Bush's personal popularity. Bush was seen as a president that you could go for a beer with, but also his reaction in the wake of 9/11 and the leadership that he showed, particularly while the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts were still popular with the American people. George W. Bush was the last Republican candidate to win the popular vote. And then the huge shift to the right under Donald Trump. Undoubtedly, the Republican Party have become increasingly conservative in the 21st century. Right now, out of the wide range of factions within the Republican Party, the Trump wing is most dominant. And so the big change that we've seen, really, is a shift away from free market economics and towards protectionism. Trump's policy of make America great again and America first was a rejection of free market economics. It was a rejection of internationalism. Trump took America out of free trade agreements such as NAFTA and started to prioritise the American economy. So we saw a shift away from the free market economics of the past. But most economic policy remains the same. The Republicans are still the party of low levels of taxation and of small government. What do we mean by small government? Low taxation, low state spending. And Republicans particularly oppose public healthcare. The vast majority of Republicans are so-called pro-life, but that phrase can take a variety of positions. Some people believe that abortion is sinful in the eyes of God because the Republicans tend to attract the more religious voters in the American population. They support the so-called traditional family, which means that many Republicans oppose same-sex marriage. The Republicans are the party that are keen to protect the Second Amendment. They see themselves as the party that is tough on drugs, particularly when it comes to the legalisation of cannabis. They oppose affirmative action programmes, preferring to view it instead as a new form of discrimination. And generally the Republicans under Bush were the party of foreign policy intervention, but that took a strange turn under Trump. Trump couldn't help but involve himself in international affairs, but in a very strange way that we haven't seen any American president, Democrat or Republican, do ever before. Donald Trump significantly improved his America's relations with Russia. He claimed that he had a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. He met with Putin at Helsinki, where he said that he did not think that there was any reason why Russians would meddle, or the Russian state would meddle in the American presidential election, which investigations by the FBI and other organisations found significant evidence of. Trump also met with and had a public display of mutual respect with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. He also took a firm pro-Israel stance, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, a city of contested heritage and contested history. And so, even though Trump was seen to be looking inward with his America First policy, there were occasions where he would intervene in the realm of foreign policy. He was, however, incredibly critical of George W. Bush's decision to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he was able to benefit from the shift in the public mood away from those conflicts. The very same voters who voted for Bush and supported Bush in 2004, largely as a result of foreign policy, were also able in 2016 to agree with Donald Trump when he was outwardly and publicly critical of that foreign policy. And so what we've seen with the Republicans is a shift to the right, a movement towards protectionism and a huge monumental shift in foreign policy outlook. But how long Trump's influence lasts remains to be seen.